Well, our last speaker before we go to Q&A is Shane Phillips, who's the Housing Initiative Project Manager at the UCLA Lewis Center Housing Initiative. Shane, take it away.
Thank you very much. Just load this here really quick. Here we go. It's great to be here. I am Shane Phillips. I work for the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies on housing research and education and policy advocacy to some extent. And what I'm talking about today is not my main job. It's not the thing I spend a ton of time on, but it's something that's gotten a little bit of attention when I first wrote about it around a year ago. And so I'm excited to share it here in a very skeletal form. And this is essentially a new model, something between renting and ownership, really not either one, and a little bit different from what both Brett and Nia talked about today. So I want to start off and just kind of make a point that is probably obvious to many people, which is that homeownership is not for everyone. Increasingly, this is true, but it's always been the case. You have to have a high income and often high wealth to access it, depending on where you live. It's very financially risky and undiversified. You're putting all of your resources, in many cases, into one property that could go up in value, could go down in value. The benefits of home value appreciation and so forth are very inequitably distributed, as Brett made clear, and I think Nia hinted at as well, especially on the racial side. And then, this is, I think, less appreciated and not one of the major problems with homeownership, but it is a downside that you are stuck in place. There are big transaction costs to moving, especially when you're buying and selling homes. And so once you've purchased a place, you're kind of stuck there. And it's just a major responsibility that some people can't manage and other people just don't want to. Not everyone should have to do all of the things that homeowners do just to have some kind of basic security. And the last one, which is really what motivated me to start thinking about this model and just different models in general, is that homeownership has political problems. People who become homeowners, on average, they have more conservative views and views more specifically that are kind of oriented toward pushing up the value of their property, which ultimately comes at the expense of future home buyers, future generations, and renters. And it does seem to be the case that this is not just people who already have these views selecting into homeownership. It's also, to at least to some extent, homeownership that is causing people to develop these views. And those views are, in effect, in the end, they can be very anti-renter and kind of widen that divide. And at the same time, we spend a ton of money subsidizing homeownership in this country. And not only subsidizing it to the tune of actually over $100 billion a year, but also in ways that often actually just make things worse. So I'm just calling out a specific study here that was done where they simulate the effect of basically eliminating the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is a subsidy to mortgage debt. And they find that eliminating it would reduce housing prices, increase homeownership, decrease mortgage debt, and improve overall welfare. So the reverse is, because we have this and we're spending tens of billions of dollars on this program every year, we're actually spending all that money only to make things worse. And on the right side here is just some different things we spend federal funds on to support homeownership. We can throw away the imputed rent one, not worry about that. It's a little complicated and I think a harder case to make. But this mortgage interest tax deduction, property tax deductions through state and local tax deductions, and capital gains exemptions, these are all things that homeowners enjoy that renters do not, that cost upwards of $60 billion a year for the country. And meanwhile, for renters, we're spending somewhere on the order of $20 billion on housing vouchers and $10 or $15 billion, I think, on low-income housing tax credits, despite homeowners having, I don't recall the number, 10 times, 20 times more wealth than renters and double the income on average. We're spending far more on them despite that. The problem is that renting isn't an attractive alternative to homeownership. All the problems of homeownership may be real, but it doesn't mean that renting is really a realistic alternative. It's very unstable. You're subject to the whims of the market, your landlord, and so on. There's no wealth generating potential. And I want to note that this is not an inevitable reality. There are lots of countries that have stronger rent culture and stronger social safety nets, so that the first issue isn't really true and the second doesn't really matter that much. But here in the US, it certainly does. So the question I've been asking is there a third option? And obviously we've heard about many different options, but I'm trying to think of something that's like, how do we combine the best of homeownership with the best of renting? And what I've come up with is something I've called shared equity rental housing. You can come up with different names for it, but just to lay this out very simply, this is essentially either the government or nonprofits or some similar entity buys rental housing, ideally with low interest loans. Tenants just move in, they rent as they normally would. Nothing from their perspective is really all that different, at least on how they pay and how they live their lives. But the surplus cash flow and depreciation goes to tenants over time, as opposed to just investors. And that's really it. That is the whole idea in the simplest form, and I can get into some more of the details. But it's really just this idea that there's a lot of profit flowing to landlords right now. And I don't grudge them for that. That's the way we've set things up. Someone has to own the property. But it's certainly possible that the owners of this property could be people who are not interested in taking that profit for themselves, if we had sort of the financing and the public policy set up to enable that, which we really don't right now. So thinking about the benefits of shared equity rental housing, and I've got a long list here that'll help me kind of explain how this might work, I think. One is you can start building wealth right away. So if you can afford to move into a place that you can rent, you can start building wealth. Very importantly, you would not build wealth in the same way or at the same rate as you would as a homeowner. There's only so much surplus from operating a rental building that it's going toward either cash flow profit or appreciation profit. So it's not nearly as much, but there is the opportunity to start building that wealth right away, right out of high school, right out of college, rather than trying to save up and maybe even just falling further and further behind, saving for a down payment rather than building something. Again, anyone who can afford rent should be able to access this, because the units would not rent for more than a typical market rate unit. There's no, this is depends how you structure it, but I think it could easily be structured so that there's no real financial risk to tenants. If the market does really poorly and prices go down, it's certainly possible that the tenants might not have built any equity, but neither would homeowners. And if the property value is going down, your rents are probably going down as well. So there's a little bit more of alignment of incentives there. To the extent that something like this can grow, this would put downward rent pressure on non-shared equity rentals, because if you could get into a shared equity rental for the same price as a non, why would you choose the latter? Tenants, this is something I think is really underappreciated, and I give a lot of thought to, is this idea that tenants could actually invest in their units in a system like this. You can imagine a tenant who wants to replace remodel their kitchen, replace some appliances, that kind of thing. And you could have a system where you have an agreement with the owners, the co-op, whoever owns it, that some part of that is increasing the value of the unit, and we're going to increase your equity stake if you make that investment. And this can kind of make the units more of your own in a way that a typical rental is not. And anyone who's rented knows you really don't want to spend a lot of money on a unit if you might have to just leave in a year and you're not going to reap any of those gains other than the experience of having it while you're there. Back to this flexibility side of things, this is the idea that you can just move whenever you want. Because this is just a rental, you would stop accruing equity and stop growing your kind of stake in the building over time. But you don't lose anything by moving in the same way that you're paying, large taxes and real estate agent fees and other things associated with buying and selling a home. And back to this politics side, fewer of these what we call home voters, people who kind of who vote based on the goal of increasing their home value and preserving their home value, even if that comes at the expense of others, which it does. And I think an important kind of political consideration here as well is that if you have something like this, you can credibly say that housing that is built today, whether it's below market or not, can become shared equity rental housing in the future, and I think that is an important selling point. And then last, this is something that would not, as I understand it, require really large public subsidies. This is something that I think the ideal is some kind of federal support in the form of either long-term loans, more than 30 years, or low interest loans, or both combined. I looked some numbers up really quickly just before this, and a 5% interest 30-year loan for $5 million is somewhere around $26,000. If you decrease the loan interest rate from 5% to 3%, the payment falls by about 22%. And if you also then increase the repayment term to 40 years, it falls by a third. So you're only paying 2/3 as much on your mortgage and everything in interest. And that is money that can be sort of redirected toward tenants over time. So just to kind of summarize here really quickly, and I know I'm kind of very much sketching out the broad outlines here and happy to answer more specific questions as we go to the Q&A. But this is, essentially a third way between homeownership and renting, giving people something a little more accessible, a little more flexible, while still giving some opportunity to build wealth and maybe even save for homeownership down the line as they're renting. Another thing that I think is important in the long run is to try to take a growing share of housing off of the totally unrestricted private market. And these types of co-ops or nonprofits or what have you could include various protections that you might not get on the private market, like some form of rent stabilization where your rent would not go up more than the inflation rate in a given year, and you can't be evicted for no cause, those kinds of things. And then I think this is really important too. This is different from a community land trust or a limited equity type of approach. And a big way in which that's true is that it is really intended to serve more of the middle income market, and importantly, not require huge subsidies that might take money from lower income housing programs. And I think that's important both because we don't want to take money from low income households who objectively need it more, but also we need to offer something to people in the middle. I just think of here in Los Angeles, we are spending billions and billions and billions of dollars, and we're even then we're only helping a tiny fraction of the low income population. Meanwhile, prices are rising, and if you're somewhere in the middle, it's just getting harder and harder. And I don't think that can justify us spending a lot of public dollars on those middle income households, because they are objectively better off than the low income households. But just again, thinking about this politically, among other things, if we have nothing to offer this wide swath of the population in terms of like, how is housing going to get better for you as well, I don't think we're going to make a lot of progress. And we really have to take a wider view on all of this and think about, okay, we know that low income households need just money mostly, but we also need to have some plan for people in the middle, and we can't leave them out. So last thing, how does this move forward? I think federal support is really necessary for this to scale. They can print money, run deficits, et cetera. They can have these really long loan periods and low interest rates that don't really kind of cost them money. One way I've been thinking about this is like the quote unquote next 30-year mortgage. For people here may be aware that the 30-year mortgage exists because of federal policy. And we could do something like that again with this kind of model. I've been reached out to by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and other kind of nonprofits and government agencies that are interested in this, but still very early days. And I've heard from a lot of private investors who actually, after writing this in the Atlantic and elsewhere, they're like, actually, I'm already thinking about this. I'm already working on it. I think the private side is promising in that it can kind of help flesh out the model. I do think it's a little flawed in that it tends to rely on home value appreciation, property appreciation. And I think we, in the long run, need to get away from that, because appreciation, again, is ultimately coming at the expense of future generations and buyers who don't have their own generational wealth to make that acquisition possible. This is a weird order, but a few places you can read. I'll just skip through this because I know there will be a recording. But the first two are things that I've written, and the third one was in the podcast I was just in a week or so ago. So thank you.
Thank you so much.